Hello, my name is Scott McSwain. I'm a Master Gardener from the 2022 cohort. I'm on the board of the WW Seymour Conservatory in Wright Park in Tacoma and got to help plant the carnivorous bog and living wall and tropical wing, parts of the tropical wing after renovations finished last year. I grew up on a dairy farm in Tennessee and moved to Tacoma from Korea about 5 years ago. I work in education. I'm currently a public school educator, specifically in Spanish dual language. These are some of my tropical plants in my greenhouse. I'm excited to talk to you all for a little while today about houseplants in the Pacific Northwest. Let's get into it. The learning objectives for today's presentation are to understand the basic care of tropical plants grown indoors through the lens of the Pacific Northwest, and also to know the common ways to propagate these plants. The photos that you see are all mine. These are some of my tropical plants in our living room. And the information comes from what I do and what I've been able to learn about some of the information and the general structure of Chapter 13 in the WSU Master Gardener Manual is what I've used to kind of like guide the presentation. So feel free to check it out for even more information on the topics presented today. Raising tropical plants in the Pacific Northwest compared to other places I've lived in America can be a challenging task, especially in those winter months, but it is definitely possible if you know your plants, know your location, and know those plants' individual needs. So we're going to talk about these 7 broad topics to help us do that today. Selecting and transporting new plants, acclimatization, environmental factors such as light, water, temperature, humidity, ventilation, fertilization, and soluble salts. And when asked the question, what's wrong with my house plant, the answer is more than likely related to one of these factors. We'll talk about planting media, containers, repotting, training plants, pruning, and propagation. So when selecting and transporting new plants, check leaves for pests and diseases before you purchase them, looking at the underside of the leaves, checking the stem, checking the soil. Avoid yellow, wilted, or blotchy plants or plants with soil that's super waterlogged. Also avoid plants that have been painted for decorative purposes. The plants are not able to photosynthesize. The plants also cannot photosynthesize. And I recommend learning the plant ID, learning the genus and the species name to research proper care. Plants, even within the same genus, may require slightly different water needs or light needs. So an example of this is Hoya obovata. Hoya is the genus, obovata is the species, Monstera adansonii. Monstera is the genus, adansonii is the species. And a little bit about that. Latin is a dead language, and people make educated guesses based on the pronunciation of Latin-based languages that we have today and descriptions of like Roman grammarians. But no one knows exactly how these words are pronounced, like exactly. So I always recommend giving people a little bit of understanding and giving yourself a little bit of understanding as well. It's hard learning all of the genus and species name or keeping up with them because they change. I also recommend just a little bit about this since we're on the subject. I recommend using the Latin names only because you can find like Swiss cheese philodendron is an ID for like 8 plants out there. Thimatophyllum, Benepiphytum, Monstera adansonii, Monstera deliciosa, Rhaphidophora tetrasperma. There's so many. And also there are some common plant names for indoor and outdoor plants that are offensive to some groups. So my rule of thumb is that if the name contains a name that could also be used to describe a person's background, then simply use the Latin name. Also, transporting plants during the hot part of the summer or the coldest parts of the winter can damage plants. I've had it happen. You can wrap plants to transport them, or my favorite method of kind of added humidity and temperature control is to have a clear tote in my car, just in case I buy a house plant when I'm out and about. And that leads me to my next section. And the clear plastic tote you can see in the photo right here. So acclimatization, plant shock. Plants going from one environment, a greenhouse, a nursery where they are grown or propagated, to another, a delivery truck, to another, like a cold storage van, to another, your house, it can go into shock. So plants that are generally grown in an environment with high light levels um, need to be brought and placed into a southern facing window first or under a full spectrum light grow light. If they're not if they're put directly into a low light situation, there are studies that the chapter actually talks about where those plants actually have to lose those leaves to grow shade leaves because in the greenhouse, the sun leaves are able to process the high amount of light, but they aren't able to process low amounts of light. So over the course of a couple of months, you can transition those plants that are new to your home to a lower light environment, and that can help with their acclimatization. So the first environmental factor we're going to talk about is light, and it's the most essential factor for houseplant growth to be successful. And it's the number one way that plants make food along with the gases. So light along with water is also normally the source of most issues I see in my houseplants and in the people who are asking me questions about what's wrong with my houseplant. It's light and water. But of course, there are other factors. The following information on the slide about light exposure depends on factors in your home, like trees outside of your windows or overhangs. But in general, the most intense sun in your home will be a southern exposure, a south exposed window. Northern exposure has only 20% of the light from the southern exposure in general. I recommend using grow lights in the Pacific Northwest in the winter. They can be fluorescent, incandescent, and full spectrum lights. These are the most common artificial lights. Plants do need red and blue lights to photosynthesize, and they need infrared light if they are flowering plants. And they're not good to leave on all day. Plants need 8 hours of darkness to grow and to function properly. So let's talk about water. Many houseplant issues are difficult to diagnose with a photo because a plant could present with chlorotic yellowing leaves, could be growing improperly with really unhealthy looking leaves and stems because of overwatering or because of underwatering. So I really do recommend putting your finger in the soil and feeling. I've not found that humidity, soil moisture readers actually give me an accurate reading. Definitely not as accurate of a reading as just putting my finger in the soil. So different plants have different watering needs, and all plants can't be watered the same on the same schedule. Your schedule will also depend on your home's humidity and the heating and the air conditioning that you run in your home. I recommend watering a plant until water is running out of the bottom of the pot. This not only gets rid of excess salts that can accumulate in the soil, but it's putting water where the majority of the roots that are doing the water absorption are, which is in the bottom part of the pot. And also, while we're on the subject, and you probably will hear me say this again, is all pots need drainage holes. There's no amount of rock or styrofoam packaging peanuts in the bottom of a pot that's going to keep the water draining out as much as a hole in the bottom would. And actually, I have found that plants with packing peanuts and rocks lead to root rot. So really recommend making sure you get pots with holes or putting the holes in the pot yourself. You'll also see bottom watering by setting plants in water to soak through the drainage holes. I've done that before, but after I passed a pest along to a lot of plants watering in the same place, that's something I don't do anymore. It's something I did do until that happened. So I recommend just watering your plants until water is running out of the bottom. And also, if your finger cannot go into the top 2 inches of soil, you need more porous soil. Yeah, so when you're checking your plants, make sure it can the top. If they need to be watered, then the top 2 inches are dry. If when you're checking that, if your finger can't even go in there, it's time for a repot. For most plants, I'd say for all plants, even ones that like to be root bound, don't like to be root bound to that degree. So this is my personal watering schedule. I water my cacti and succulents once a month in the winter and a couple times a month during the hottest summer months. I water my aeroids. Those are the, like in this picture right here, this is an anthurium. There's the anthuriums, philodendrons, syngoniums, among others, once every couple of weeks in the winter months and roughly once a week during the summer. And my Hoyas get watered once a month or so in the winter and twice a month in the summer. So most houseplants grow best between 70 and 80 degrees during the day, 21 to 27 degrees Celsius, and 60 to 68 degrees at night, or down to 16 degrees Celsius at night. But there are some flowering plants like the epiphytic jungle cacti, Ripsalis, Lepidopsis, Christmas cacti, those things that like it even cooler, um, and can be around 55 degrees at night. So when it comes to humidity, if your home is one where you are maybe running more heat and the humidity is down, or the humidity is low, then you can use a humidifier. People also put wet gravel on a tray that the pot sits on, and grouping plants together can even help. And as you can see in this photo, during some winter months when I move some of my most like tender tropical plants indoors, I put them into totes under grow lights where they maintain a much higher level of humidity. The next factor is ventilation. Keep plants away from drafty doors and windows and away from heat sources. As you can see in this photo, I also do keep a fan on my large tropicals. Um, and when it comes to fertilization, plants need fertilizers containing nitrogen and phosphoric acid, which is P, and potassium, which is K. And so on the majority of fertilizers, you'll see like a number dash a number dash a number, and that is just the ratio of nitrogen to phosphoric acid to potassium. So I'm a big fan of worm tea as a houseplant fertilizer, but there are so many out there. The next factor is one that doesn't get talked about as much, but it's soluble salts, and you can see them forming right here on the lake in one of my propagated philodendrons. So it's this flaky white buildup that can crust on the soil and on pots, especially terracotta. If you have terracotta pots, you might see this. And so these are minerals that are dissolved in water that are normally washed out with correct watering, that deep watering, but they can cause a lot of trouble for our plants. So signs of a buildup of too much of these soluble salts are reduced growth, if the leaf tips are getting brown, if it's dropping lower leaves, and if the plant is abnormally wilting. So when it comes to planting media, there are lots of tropical plant soils available commercially, but it is best to mix your own. The book recommends a bushel of shredded peat moss. Since then, we've learned that peat moss is not sustainable. It takes thousands of years for this stuff to grow. So I recommend cocoa coir or orchid bark. The 2 bushels of perlite, half cup of the 888 fertilizer that we talked about in the last slide, and then a teaspoon of chelated iron. My tropical mix is a little bit different, but accomplishes some of the same goals that the book soil mix recommends. I do a 50% orchid bark, 25% high quality soil, 15% perlite, and 10% charcoal. And that helps with the structure and it decreases that soil density. And this is my grandma's cactus mix. The year before she passed, she won the Tennessee State Fair in like the unusual plant category by growing this really, really tall kalanchoe, and this is her cactus mix: 3 parts potting soil, 2 parts sand, and 1 part perlite. So these are the types of containers that are most commonly used for houseplants. There's terracotta or clay, very good for succulents. I'd say not the best for aeroids because they just absorb too much of the moisture. There's plastic and fiberglass pots like the peach colored and brown colored one that you see in this photo here. It's the most common and it's light and easy to use. But like I said before, no matter what the pot that you choose for your houseplant is, the most important factor is that it has drainage. Just want to avoid root rot, want to avoid that pot becoming a bog, unless it's a carnivorous plant, and that's a whole other conversation. So repotting. Repotting is a part of owning tropical plants long term. Some plants will need to be repotted more often, more sooner. I teach grammar. Will need to be repotted sooner than other plants, but some plants don't mind being root bound. My Hoyas love being root bound, and others do not like it so much. Monstera adansonii being one in my experience. So when repotting, gently loosen soil from the roots and place a little bit of the soil mix that you've made in the bottom of the pot, and make sure that the next pot is just 2 inches bigger than the previous pot. Makes me think of like hermit crabs, just one shell bigger. And then fill soil all around the sides of the roots, and make sure that you don't put soil all the way up to the top of the pot. Make sure to leave headroom so that you have space for watering. So many tropical plants produce their most mature and, in my opinion, their most beautiful leaves when they're trained. This is the case for Rhaphidophora, for Monstera, for Scindaptus. Aroids have aerial roots that need to be misted often whenever they go into these moss poles. They attach themselves to them so that they can support themselves and grow those larger leaves. And you can see my Philodendron subhostatum right here that's growing on a moss pole that I made for it. You can buy these, but you can also make them. They're pretty inexpensive to make. You do have to prune houseplants every once in a while. If a plant's not getting enough light, if they become leggy or etoilated, they should be pruned and moved to a brighter spot. If you have a cactus that I've given several people cacti and succulents, and like, it's growing so much, and I'm like, oh no. But it should be, they can be pruned down. Those can be rooted and put back into the soil, and then you'll just have a bushier plant growing, hopefully in a spot with a little bit more light. So now we're going to talk about one of my favorite aspects of owning houseplants, and that's getting to propagate them so that you can share plants with people that you love, or people that you just tolerate. The 3 main types of plant propagation are by stem cuttings, leaf cuttings, and then separating plantlets. There are other ways that you can propagate, like air layering, but it's basically just stem cuttings with a little pre-step. If you're interested in air layering, you can send me an email. I'll make my email available at the end of this presentation. So stem cutting, you take cuttings from newer, fast-growing stems, and you use clean scissors to cut just below the node of the 3rd or 4th set of leaves. You remove those bottom sets of leaves as well, leaving the top 2 or 3 leaves. I put a picture right here that shows the node of a Philodendron fuzzy petiole. And I recommend letting a lot of aroid cuttings callus, kind of air dry, for 12 hours, 24 hours. That really does help the cuttings not rot, being put right directly into water or rooting media. And so I have also seen people put those cuttings, after they put them in rooting media, put them in a plastic bag or in a humidity tub. They root so much better when they have a lot of sunlight and when they are very humid. So common plants propagated with this type of stem cutting method are listed right here. The most common ones in our homes being Hoya, Peperomia, Philodendron, Rhaphidophora, Pelea, Pothos, and Tradescantia. Leaf cuttings are also a way that many plants can be propagated. Not all plants. You'll see Monstera is not on this list, and I had to give really bad news to so many people who sent me a photo and said, Scott, why is my Monstera not rooting? And I'm like, you don't have a node, you just have a leaf, and they do not reproduce that way. Some things that should not be propagated via leaf cuttings can develop roots, but more than likely it will just be that one leaf, probably a beautiful leaf for the rest of its life. So for plants that can be propagated via leaf cuttings, cut healthy mature leaves from the parent plant, and then take about 1 inch of the leaf petiole and place in rooting media. Common plants that we have that propagated this way are begonia, like the picture I put here, crassula, sansevieria, but the snake type plant of sansevieria, not there's a newly incorporated recent, like a reclassification of Dracaena, and some sedums. Now talking about the propagation method of removing plantlets from what is often called a mother plant. You can see me right here removing Sansevieria whalefin from its mom. It's not called mom, but I digress. So detach the plantlets from the plant parent. Place the bottom in rooting media so that the plantlet rests on the media. And these are some common plants that are propagated this way. Tillandsias, those air plants, snake plants, bromeliads, and spider plants. This is a list of the most common media used for rooting. Um, some people swear by just putting it in water. And in my classroom right now, I have clippings of a lot of different plants, Ahoya, philodendron, epiphyllum, and a rickrack epiphytic plant. And they're all rooting right now wonderfully just in water. But I also really like to root things in perlite. As you can see, this philodendron squamiferum right here is rooting in perlite. You can also use a mix of, it's like half vermiculite or perlite, and then half medium grade coco coir or moss. And then you can also use leca, which are the clay balls, like in the photo that you could see the soluble salts forming. It is an acronym that stands for light expandable clay aggregate, and I really do like using it. There's another one too called pone or lechuza pone, and it's a substrate made entirely of minerals. It's expensive. It's sometimes hard to get, and expensive and hard to get when some things can root in water or perlite. Just is the reason why I put it at the end of the list. This is another example, this photo of philodendron I have rooting in the leca and in a mason jar. I think it looks nice, but it works really well. Although sometimes you do have to break the mason jar to get it out. That's not what we're talking about here, though. So tips for successful propagation. I recommend watering the parent plant the day before propagating, just like in the garden. Watering before you harvest just ensures that the plant is healthier, lasts longer. You can also use rooting hormone. I have some. I've used it on some persnickety plants, but it's not necessary. Also, increased humidity helps propagation. It's why I place newly clipped plants into plastic totes, but you can also do it in plastic bag or a large Ziploc or other containers. And then when plants have a small network of roots, a few inches in length, I plant it in a 3-inch container with the soil mixture from earlier in this presentation. So that's our presentation. Thank you so much for spending about 20 minutes with me talking about how to take better care of our tropical houseplants. If you have questions about my presentation or want to know more about anything that I spoke about in the presentation, here's my email, scott.mcswain@gmail.com. Have a wonderful day and happy planting.